Okay, this is our lesson on, or our lecture, whatever, on minimalism, minimalization, minimalisms, and there's a capital M minimalism, which has a very specific meaning, and then there's just the idea of minimalization, which is a kind of an impetus or an impulse that we find in classical music and many other art forms in the 20th century, and of course many other centuries. You could also talk about maximalization. And in fact, some music historians now talk about the idea that modernist music, including especially Schoenberg and all the people that he influenced, which would be kind of a majority of composers of the 20th century, as well as I would say the Schoenberg and his progeny, that's a maximalist idea. Maybe the early Stravinsky ballets were kind of maximalist. Of course, that wasn't a term that was used until fairly recently, but used in response to the idea of minimalism and the impulse of lowercase minimalism, minimalization. So it puts things into perspective. If we're talking about minimalization in music, in other words, reducing the amount of some parameter, some data, the number of sounds or the number of notes or the duration of pieces, any kind of parameter of music, instead of expanding it. So, again, when I mentioned Schoenberg and other modernist composers, this idea of saying, well, let's use more notes, let's use more sounds. We've looked at extended techniques, more timbres, more ways of manipulating an instrument, microtonality, expanding the number of pitch classes that are available. These are all kind of maximalist impulses, I would say. But, in terms of minimalization, I think the first composer that comes to mind is one that we've talked about a lot, Webern, who I think anybody would describe his music as sort of minimalist in impulse, minimalizing in texture specifically, but also in pitches. You remember we looked at the symphony, which the exposition of the symphony, the first movement of the symphony, only uses 13 pitches, uses 12 pitch classes, but all of them except for E flat are fixed in one octave placement. And then you think of the tone row that was used in that piece, it actually reduced the number of row forms from 48 to 24. So this, and then of course, like I said, these very transparent textures, this reduced orchestra size, kind of like, 2 or 3 notes per gesture. So Webern's music is very minimalist in one sense, very strong minimalizing tendency. Then, we recently at BYU performed this Carmina Burana by Orff. His music is viewed as kind of proto-minimalist because it has some of the aspects of uppercase minimalism in it. Those being the modality, using modes, drones, repetitive rhythms, kind of motoric eighth note rhythms, and just repetition without variation, which is sort of ends up being maybe one of the main characteristics of classic uppercase minimalism. And then we think of Stravinsky, I would say, also a minimalist. His kind of version of minimalism, again, this is not uppercase minimalism, this is minimalization. It's taking existing forms, existing styles, and stripping away everything except for a part of the surface of these styles, which is something he did, beautifully with Romantic styles, Baroque styles, and even 12-tone serialism. He after Schoenberg died, he took up 12-tone serialism and kind of minimalized it, both texturally, somewhat similarly to Webern, but also made a much more sort of transparent version of serialism that, I mean, similar to Webern's approach of actually trying to make the 12-tone row audible and make the character of the music shaped by that, but in a different way, from Webern. And but we're going to spend most of our time talking about classic minimalism, uppercase minimalism, this phenomenon that started in maybe the late 60s or early 60s even, and continued through the early 70s. It was a fairly short movement, but in another way it continues to this day. But the kind of classic sort of doctrinaire period of minimalism was really the 1960s and early 70s. And so it was kind of a burst of activity, and to a certain extent, doctrinaire minimalism has a somewhat limited, possibly a limited scope, a limited ability to generate material. Maybe. This is arguable. Okay. One of the things I like about minimalism and talking about minimalism is that it's one of the few musical styles that we'll look at that actually has a very straightforward lineage. And I'm going to get out my whiteboard because it's going to be useful for what I need to do. And of course, we know about Steve Reich and Philip Glass. And by the way, I say Reich because Steve Reich changed the pronunciation of his last name from Reich to Reich because of the Third Reich I believe in the early 1990s. He started objecting to that pronunciation. So anyway, we have Reich and Glass, Philip Glass and Steve Reich down here. But above that, let's go to the top. I think what we have to start out with is Erik Satie. Okay. Now, if you're familiar with his music, Erik Satie was a contemporary of Debussy's. He was active from the 1880s through the 19-teens. And he was a very interesting composer, kind of an absurdist composer. But one of the things that he explored in his music was music that didn't have the dramatic structure that we expect from classical music, that we expected or people expected, really starting from, I don't know, the Renaissance right up until the early 20th century and beyond. But Satie wrote very static pieces of music that kind of stayed the same and were very repetitive and also modal, that didn't tend to modulate necessarily, and that dwelt on a limited harmonic palette that established a mood and kind of sat there. And the number of moods that he used was kind of limited also. He even had an essay where he talked about, I think he called it furniture music. He basically described like New Age music or spa music or whatever you want to call it. Of course, this is before, recording technology would have allowed that. So he was sort of imagining music that I guess that would have been live. But anyway, another reason we put him as the sort of, I don't know, great-great-grandfather of minimalism is that John Cage was a big proponent of Satie's. They didn't really overlap, but Cage was a great admirer of Satie's work. And I think specifically he was influenced by this idea of having pieces of music that don't have the kind of dramatic structure that, again, goes pretty far back, but the real composer who established this idea that music should have a structure, it should cover ground, it should go somewhere, it should have a narrative, that's Beethoven, and Beethoven was the composer that we think of in terms of establishing music as this great art form and this sort of model of the universe or of an organism, etc., the organic model of musical structure or artistic structure. And we'll talk about Cage in a moment, but he wrote pieces that were harmonically and rhythmically static and repetitive, and that kind of resisted the idea that music should contain development or variation. Then we have what I would call the most influential Mormon composer, Lamont Young, who's still alive. Lamont Young is, sometimes he's called the granddaddy of minimalism, certainly by Reich and Glass and others. He didn't write music that sounds like these composers, but he was the sort of the first one, I don't know, first one, but he wrote music that's radically resists this idea that a piece of music should be a kind of evolving or developing organism, and that has a beginning, middle, and end, and that makes you feel like you've gone somewhere. So his music tends to be very static. And Lamont Young especially has specialized in drones and in long tone pieces. So pieces that go for long periods of time with a single chord or sonority, or they change very gradually. And he also, we looked at his well-tuned piano in the reference to just intonation, but the well-tuned piano is very much an example of musical minimalism, I think. So Lamont Young, very influential, active starting in the late 50s. His first piece that really is like sort of the first minimalist piece was a trio for strings that he wrote when he was a graduate student at UC Berkeley, and it was a 12-tone piece, but it consisted of long tones, long tones played by each instrument. I think the piece only goes through the 12-tone row once, and I can't remember how long it lasts. So this was a big bombshell, and then this kind of influenced the rest of his musical output. Then we have Terry Riley, who's a really important bridge between Young and Reich and Glass. Terry Riley, among other things, wrote a piece called In C, which again we looked at in reference to indeterminate music. This is the first piece that kind of sounds like minimalism, in that it has this sort of motoric eighth note pulse, and of course very modal, very centered around a single tonic. These terms modal and tonal are kind of tricky, but we call it modal because it doesn't depend so much on harmonic motion, doesn't involve modulation. It more involves the idea of, centricity around a central tone and then adherence to a heptatonic scale. In the case of In C, the Riley piece starts out mainly in C major, and then he kind of adds B flat and F sharp here and there, so it kind of evolves a little bit. Open instrumentation piece again. Just refer you back to our discussion about indeterminacy. Then we get Reich and Glass. And these three composers, and this one, but especially these three, are all kind of the same generation. Maybe, like a couple of years older, as we go up. Cage also knew all of these composers. They were in the same circles in New York City. Although Riley spent more time in California, Reich also was in California. He actually got his master's degree at Mills College, where I got my master's degree. Riley also taught at Mills College. Cage was at Mills College. Mills College is kind of a, it's an important place for minimalism and other forms of American experimental music, or whatever we want to call it. But anyway, so then we get Reich and Glass. And the interesting thing here is there's a little bit of a feud still going on between these composers as to who was the real sort of original minimalist. In as much as, again, if we're talking about uppercase minimalism, it's Reich and Glass. And these composers, again, they played in each other's ensembles, knew each other very well, dedicated pieces to each other. Steve Reich's technique, we'll talk about him in a moment, focused on at least his minimalist music, and to a certain extent his later music, which got less minimalist, is based on this technique called phasing that we'll talk about, and then Philip Glass, addition and subtraction, essentially. So now what I'd like you to do, let's start with Satie. We've talked about Satie. I'd like you to take a moment, you can pause this for a sec, and listen to a little of the Satie Gnossienne number 4, which again is proto-minimalist piece, quite repetitive, doesn't really go anywhere. So take a moment, listen to a minute or two or more of this piece. This video has a score. And okay, do that. Okay, hopefully you've done a little listening. Now I've included a piece by Cage, which we actually looked at when we talked about extended techniques, but I'd like you to look at it again, the Cage Baccanale for prepared piano. Now, in addition to being the first prepared piano piece, you'll notice that this piece includes very specific numbered repetitions of little cells, little motives or licks. And Cage actually talked about that, and he said his main teacher in music was Arnold Schoenberg, which comes as a surprise to some people. And Cage said that one of the things that Schoenberg, and Schoenberg provided like it feels sometimes like Cage was both influenced by and trying to go against his teacher, spending his life trying to prove Schoenberg wrong, even though he had great respect for him. But he said that Schoenberg taught a principle, which I suppose goes back to Wagner and then to Beethoven, which is that music should be essentially continual variation. And that's what music is, developing variation. So, again, modeling this idea of the growth of an organism, and so, and of course, a very successful model for music, at least in classical music and jazz to a certain extent. But Cage said, well, if you have variation, that's just another kind of repetition. And he actually said he thought this was dishonest, because if you're having a variation, you're just repeating, and don't say that it's better than repetition. So he said, well, I'm just going to be really honest. Cage was very, very into his integrity. This was important to him, to be honest and not to be caught up with erroneous thinking. So he said, okay, this piece is not going to have variation. It's going to have numbers of repetition. That's the logic behind this piece. So in that way, it's very much of a minimalist piece. It has this concept of repetition instead of variation. Okay, so if you can listen to that for a moment, for a couple of minutes, and then come back. Pause this for a sec. Okay, I've included one piece by Young. This is very exciting. It used to be very difficult to find recordings of Lamont Young's music. He was a very unusual guy. I mean, all these people were kind of, bohemian in their sort of lifestyle and outlook. Probably Reich and Glass the least so, although we could say some interesting things about them. But so the Lamont Young, the Tortoise, His Dreams and Journeys, gives you an idea of this kind of early drone-based music from the early 60s, which he continued throughout his life. In fact, there's a piece, The Dream House in New York City. It's essentially a single piece that's a dronescape that's been going on for 50 years maybe, a continuous sound in a gallery in New York City. Anyway, take a moment and listen to this piece, and this will give you an idea of at least one aspect of Lamont Young's drone-based minimalist music. So listen to some of that, please. Okay, and then, of course, I've included the original recording of Terry Riley's In C. I've also included a link to the score, which I'd like you to look at. I mean, we already looked at it in reference to indeterminacy. So take a minute and listen to some of that. This one you can kind of listen to the beginning and then maybe skip ahead a little bit and skip ahead and get an idea of how it gradually develops. And this is kind of an important piece because this is the model that Glass and Reich follow, in that, music is this sort of one-way journey that proceeds very gradually, which makes it hard to talk about in a class. I always have trouble when I'm teaching a normal class because we're so used to listening to little excerpts of things or 4-minute pieces, and then it's like, well, these are pieces that you can't experience with under 30, 40 minutes, 2 hours, whatever, to really experience what they're like. But anyway, listen to some of that. Terry Riley in C, please. Okay, now we get to the bottom. Again, the Doctrine of Minimalists. I've already talked about them. Reich and Glass. Now, let's talk about Reich first. Now, Steve Reich, again, we don't have time to talk about everything in this regard. He wrote a very good little essay called Music as a Gradual Process, and I will include a link to that under this video. It's a page and a half. Maybe, actually, no, that's on your worksheet. So, yeah, you will have read that. But Steve Reich got really interested he was at Mills College, and they had now I can't remember all the history, but the San Francisco Tape Music Center migrated to Mills College in Oakland, California, became the Center for Contemporary Music. And, in the early and mid 60s, one of the main tools for electronic music was the tape deck. Now, these are reel-to-reel tape decks. And I'll try to draw this for you so you can see what I'm talking about. But the idea was, it was somewhat like a film projector, but you'd have, your box here, and then you'd have a reel here and a reel here, and, they're attached somehow. And then you have the tape. Maybe this would be the full reel, and the tape would go through here and pass through this tape head, which would read it and then transmit the sound, electronic impulses that were translated into sound. And then the tape would go up and be wound here. So this would start full, and then it would eventually end up here, like a film projector. Now, I don't think Reich came up with this idea, but someone thought, well, wait a minute, what if we just have a tape loop? We'll just tape it together with splicing tape, and you'll have this loop go around and around. You have this repeated sound or phrase or whatever. And of course, these tape machines had variable speed, and so you could change that. There were also ways you could lengthen the tape loop. I know one composer, Bob Ostertag, used balloons, helium balloons, that would pull up on the tape and enable a longer tape loop while maintaining the tension on the tape loop. Well, anyway, loop. When you talk about loops and looping, which we hear a lot about, of course, in electronic music, any kind of popular music that's based on, electronic means, it's all about loops. The term loop comes from this. So Reich became interested in this, but more specifically, he became interested in the concept of having two tape machines, this and another one, recording duplicating a tape loop, having them both play the same tape loop, and then varying the speed slightly so that there's a gradual going out of phase. And of course, the concept of phase is very important in acoustics and any kind of wave properties, but the music going in and out of phase with each other. And he did this specifically with a couple of tape pieces that use this technique, that use two and actually more tape machines playing the same loop. The piece that's best known would be Come Out. So I've included this piece below, if you can click on Come Out. And again, with these long pieces, start at the beginning, then kind of skip ahead a little bit, skip ahead, and kind of get an idea. What you're going to hear is that you're going to hear these tape loops being in sync and then very slowly going out of sync. It's a slow process, but each moment has a different effect, a different sonic effect. So it's very interesting. Plus the effect of the change itself, the liminality of it. Wait, when did it change? What does that sound like? This seems like a very minor change, and yet it's completely altered the how I experience it. So that's kind of the exciting. We might compare this to like an optical illusion. It's like an aural illusion, or a kind of meditation. You know, again, instead of focusing on building up a piece of music that is itself has a, you know, kind of an organic structure, this is focusing more on the actual experience of hearing and listening and experiencing one's own organic response to sound. So anyway, take a moment and listen to some of that and skip around, come out. Okay, now this technique, which Steve Reich originally used with tape decks, he adapted to use with live instruments in a very interesting way. And the first piece I want to show you, I can't remember if this was the first live phase piece that Steve Reich wrote. I don't think it is, actually. I think violin phase might be the first one. But anyway, this is very well known and it's really fun to listen to, and I've included a link to a performance with the score. It's that's the entire piece, essentially. That little tune, what is it, 8 notes? No, 12 notes. And what happens is 2 pianists play this little tune, and then one of them stays the same throughout, playing it just exactly the same. The other pianist gradually gets a little bit faster, and tiny bit faster, until he or she, they get out of phase with each other, you know, kind of like this, and then they sync up on the 16th, I can't really do this, but on the 16th note, the next 16th note, so that I can't really do this on the piano, but so like that, gradually until it, something like that. Anyway, you get the picture. Listen to this again with these pieces, since they're so long. Listen to the beginning, maybe kind of nudge ahead until you hear this effect of this gradual moving apart and then this locking into the new groove. Okay, good. And then finally, for Steve Reich, and there's lots of music of Steve Reich we could look at, of course, but I want you to look at clapping music. I've included a link to that. This one's kind of cool because it has this sort of cool notation. It has, you know, hands doing clapping, and then it has this dot notation underneath. Anyway, clapping music. This is a piece that you could do with, you know, of course you're supposed to be sheltering in place, but it's a piece that would be pretty, I mean, you can do without the score. It's easy to describe, but essentially, you've got this situation in which I got to find something to wipe this with. Oh, that worked pretty well. Anyway, you've got this. That's the whole piece, basically. If you look at it closely, you'll notice that we have, I should make this a little bit better. Let's do this. There's a rest. Okay. Da-da-da, da-da, da, da-da. What you'll notice, let me put one of these here. It's 3/8 notes followed by an 8th note rest, 2/8 notes followed by an 8th note rest, 1/8 note followed by an 8th note rest. And then it goes backwards, back to 2, back to 3, back to 2, back to 1, etc. So it's like a, you know, it goes into retrograde. Same thing here, 2 clappers doing this. One of them does this straight, the other one, you know, moves ahead. But in this case, he doesn't have that gradual moving ahead. You just lock, lock, lock. So listen to a little of this and then look at the kind of fun notation underneath. And again, you can kind of skip around to get an idea of what happens. Okay, that's Philip Glass. Now that he used a few other techniques, but this is the main one. He applied these techniques to his later, less sort of doctrinarily minimalist music. But let's talk about Philip Glass. And Philip Glass, definitely not only the most successful minimalist composer, but probably the most successful classical composer in the world right now. And I should say both he and Steve Reich, very successful entrepreneurs. And their music and their whole practice was really based on, they viewed themselves as, how do I describe it? You know, kind of disruptors. I guess you hear that term disruptors a lot. And, you know, breaking into this world of music or creating their own DIY, creating their own infrastructure for music making. They both started their own ensembles that toured around and played their music. They played in their ensembles. This is not done at the time. And so, very interesting. And Philip Glass happened to have a lot of success, sort of in the middle of his career. He had an opera produced by the Metropolitan Opera Company in 1976, and then later, actually maybe in the 90s, he started writing film music, and then so since that time he's been a very successful film composer, and that's probably resulted in all his success in the classical world, where he's probably the highest. His commissions are the highest of any composer in the world, probably. His main methods are addition and subtraction, very simply. And this is this idea of, I mean, I could just make something up, you know. Etc. That's like a really simple version. But if you want to see a piece that really illustrates the concept of addition and subtraction in its most elemental, I've included this really weird YouTube, but it's a very useful one, of Philip Glass's 2 pages for Steve Reich. This is an electronic realization, which neither Reich nor Glass really engaged in this kind of thing. They like to have live players. They like the energy of live musicians, but and the tempo on this is much faster. I don't know, twice as fast as what the piece is supposed to be, but that's kind of cool because it gives you an idea of what's going on. So why don't you take a minute, listen to some of two pages. Again, listen to it, maybe skip ahead, see how this piece plays out, which includes the score. Very simple score. Okay. You've listened to that. Now that's a very, very, how do I describe it? I mean, this is severe minimalism. You know, this is minimalism that really tests the definition of music. You know, is this music, is that enough material to be classed as a piece, blah, blah, blah. Of course it is. I mean, we can't really argue with it but at this point, but we want to go to a piece that's even more elemental. This is his first, at least according to Glass, his first piece using addition and subtraction, called 1+1 for, I think it's any number of players on a tabletop, tapping on a tabletop. I've included a pretty cool video of it and the score. So please open up the score and listen to at least some of the recording that I've heard for 1+1. Okay, and then I've included 2 other pieces. Again, we don't need to say much about this. It's a pretty straightforward method. That's what's so kind of interesting and powerful about both Reich and Glass, is their sort of unapologetic simplicity and basicness of the methods that they used, and the fact that they used methods. I will say that Reich was a lot more stuck to his processes a lot more than Glass. Glass was a little more free-flowing. You know, when he wrote music, he did use addition and subtraction and a few other techniques, but he kind of wrote from beginning to end in a kind of rhapsodic way using these simple methods. Reich came up with, you know, he was kind of a top-down guy. He had an entire concept of a piece and he sort of followed it. But anyway, piece called Music with Changing Parts, a more complex application of, it's still a very straightforward, simple, process-based piece. But music with changing parts, listen to a couple of minutes of that to get an idea of it. Okay, and so that's a piece that Glass wrote for his ensemble called Philip Glass and Musicians. And then finally, I've included an excerpt from Philip Glass's first opera, and I think best opera. Very interesting piece, Einstein on the Beach, written in collaboration with the great director Robert Wilson and playwright, I guess. Train, which is, I think, the coolest part of that opera. This is like a 5-hour opera with no intermissions. It was premiered in 1976. It sort of defies all the conventions of opera. It doesn't really have a plot. It sort of has characters, but it's kind of, you might say it's more of a dance piece, although a lot of the performers are not necessarily trained dancers, although they do sort of dance-esque activities. A lot of it is about the set and the lights and the costumes and the music and the movement. The movement in this particular section is quite repetitive. A lot of the movements tend to be very slow and glacial. You know what's going to happen. You're watching what's going to happen. Like the train going very slowly across the stage. It's like there are no surprises. It's not like traditional dramatic structure has to involve surprise, And minimalism isn't really about that. It's, we could talk for a long time about this, but I think it's about audacity and inexorability, this idea that something's going to happen. It's surprising that it is going to happen exactly as you're watching it. And it's kind of like, an impending doom or an impending positive thing that's going to happen. I don't know. There are lots of ways to look at it. But also, again, I mentioned this idea of experiencing this long process and observing your own body and mind's reaction to that, and just experiencing the basic things that are happening in a piece. So listen to watch a little bit of Einstein on the Beach and kind of take that in. By the way, I saw this for the first time, this is like 7 years ago, in Los Angeles. It's only played once every 10 years or so. And again, 5 hours. I have to say I was completely entranced the whole time. I wasn't expecting to be. I just sat there, and so did everybody else. It was just a very, again, once this minimalist music, it sets up a new temporality because it's slowly evolving. Your mind adapts to that temporality, which we could talk about that, because I mentioned that Webern being a minimalist, and his music was made up of very short movements, very short. If we think of the Bagatelles for string quartet, I think one of those movements is like 11 seconds long. The whole set takes less than 4 minutes. Again, challenging the notions of temporality until we hear a 4-minute piece and we're surprised at how short it was. I mean, that sounds like an insult, but I don't think it is. Okay, let's do a little bit of Einstein on the Beach, and then after you do that, I'll wrap up. Okay, so that's a quick run through of minimalism. We could talk about post-minimalism or kind of other simultaneous movements. This will get tricky, but we could talk about minimalists in Europe or post-minimalists in Europe and America. The post-minimalists in Europe, and I'll include this underneath the video, a little bit on this. Arvo Pärt, Gorecki, Louis Andriessen, and then the American post-minimalists. There are lots of those, but I would definitely mention James Tenney, who also grew up Mormon, by the way, and fascinated with just intonation. Sort of like, again, he was composing his music in the same period as Steve Reich, but Tenney is in this mold of a piece should be a single process that plays itself out, and Tenney's pieces tend to be very strict. He doesn't interfere with the process. Pauline Oliveros, who wrote long tone drone music for many years. Peter Garland. Anyway, there are lots of others we could talk about. And if we had time, we would talk about them. We would talk about how minimalism really has changed the course of music. Probably, it's kind of the big moment in the evolution of classical music of the late 20th century, because it really suggested that the older and I would say, highly successful paradigm, again, that music is an art form that involves continual variation, organic development, is not necessarily what things have to be, and that music can be any number of things, and that music can be repetitive, that a composer doesn't have to always show off or audition every time he or she writes a piece of music, that a piece of music can be very simple and not demonstrate any skill necessarily. And also this idea that composers can work outside of the traditional musical infrastructure, classical music infrastructure, and can perform and do things in rock clubs and jazz clubs. I mean, there are many, many implications. And so minimalism has really changed classical music forever, I would say. I was certainly enamored with it when I was an undergraduate. My teachers didn't like it. They thought it was kind of wicked. And I've certainly written music that could be defined as minimalist. In fact, maybe I'll include one piece of mine that's just basically a minimalist piece. That uses addition and subtraction in my own version, called Acme. I forget the number. Anyway, I'll include that. You don't have to listen to it, but if you want to see what I've done with minimalism, please do that. Okay, good to be with you. Continue exploring. This is a fun area, and this music is fun to listen to, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye.